My mother-in-law didn't lower her voice when she said it, not even in the hospital room, not even with the doctor standing 3 feet away from my bed. She just crossed her arms, looked straight at me, and said, "You failed as a woman," like it was a simple fact, like I had broken something on purpose. And for a second, no one said anything. Not the nurse, not the doctor, not even my husband. And that silence felt heavier than anything she said because I was still lying there, still numb, still trying to understand how I had just lost my baby and somehow became the one being blamed. And the worst part was, this wasn't even the moment that broke me, because what they didn't know was that everything had already started changing long before that day. But I'll come back to that. Only if this story truly resonates with you. Take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always read every comment, especially from those who feel this kind of story in their chest. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 32 years old, and that was the morning everything in my family quietly fell apart. But to understand why I didn't say a single word back to her, you have to go back to where it really started, because none of this happened overnight. Not the way they treated me, not the way my husband looked away, and definitely not the decision I made later. It all built slowly, in small moments that didn't seem important at the time, until they were. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and something faintly metallic. The lights were too bright, and I remember staring at the ceiling tiles. Because I couldn't bring myself to look at anyone, my hands were resting on my stomach without thinking, like my body hadn't caught up with reality yet, like it still believed something was there. The doctor had just finished explaining everything in a calm, careful tone, using words like complications and not your fault. But those words didn't land. They just floated somewhere above me. And then my mother-in-law stepped closer to the bed, her heels making that sharp sound against the floor. And I could feel her presence before I even looked at her. She didn't touch me, didn't ask if I was okay, didn't lower her voice. She just said it, clear and steady, like she had been waiting to say it for a long time. A real woman would have protected that baby. And I felt something inside me tighten, not explode, not break loudly, just tighten, like a door closing somewhere deep. I glanced at Daniel, my husband, standing near the window, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, and for a second, I thought he would say something, anything, but he didn't. He just looked down at the floor, avoiding my eyes, avoiding the moment, and that was when I understood something I hadn't wanted to see before. That I was alone in that room in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital. The nurse shifted uncomfortably but didn't intervene. The doctor cleared his throat and stepped back, and the conversation moved on like nothing had happened, like those words hadn't just been placed on my chest. I didn't cry, not there, not in front of them. I just nodded slightly, like I had accepted something, even though I hadn't, and that small movement seemed to satisfy her. She stepped back, already done with me. Already turning her attention to Daniel, asking him practical questions about follow-up appointments and future plans, like I wasn't even part of the conversation anymore. And that was how it had always been with her. Subtle at first, small comments about how I wasn't strong enough, how I needed to take better care of myself, how women in her family didn't have these problems, things that could almost pass as concern if you didn't listen too closely. But I had listened. I just hadn't responded. Because I believed that if I was patient, if I was kind, if I proved myself over time, things would change. I thought marriage meant building something together, not constantly defending your place in it. And for a while, I convinced myself it was getting better, that the tension was fading, that Daniel's silence was just his way of dealing with pressure. But looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly, the way he would stay quiet when his mother spoke, the way he would change the subject instead of correcting her. The way I slowly started editing myself, choosing my words more carefully, trying not to cause problems, trying to be easier, quieter, less noticeable. And maybe that's why I didn't react in that hospital room, because somewhere along the way, I had learned that speaking up didn't change anything. It only made things worse. So I stayed still. I stayed quiet, and I let the moment pass. At least on the outside, but inside, something shifted. Something that had been building for months without anyone realizing it. Something I hadn't even fully admitted to myself yet, because while they were busy deciding who I was and what I was worth, I had already started building a version of my life that didn't depend on their approval. Late nights at the kitchen table with my laptop open, small freelance projects I never mentioned, money I quietly set aside, plans I told no one about. It didn't look like much from the outside, just a few extra hours, a few emails, a few contracts, but it was the first thing that felt like mine in a long time. And that morning in the hospital, as I lay there listening to my mother-in-law define my worth in a single sentence, I realized something I hadn't been ready to face before, that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to be enough for them. And for the first time, that realization didn't make me want to try harder. It made me want something else entirely. But I didn't say that out loud. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just closed my eyes for a second, took a slow breath, and let the silence stay exactly where it was. Because what happened next wouldn't happen in that room, and they wouldn't see it coming. The ride home was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel louder. The turn signal clicking, the tires rolling over uneven pavement, the faint hum of the air conditioner, and I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap, staring out the window as the city moved past us like nothing had changed, but everything had. Daniel kept his eyes on the road the entire time, both hands on the steering wheel, his jaw tight, like he was concentrating on something difficult, but I knew that look. It was the same look he used whenever he did not want to have a conversation, whenever he hoped silence would make things disappear. I waited for him to say something, anything, maybe an apology, maybe a simple, "Are you okay?" But the words never came, and after 10 minutes, I realized they were not going to. So I turned my attention back to the window, watching people walking on sidewalks, carrying coffee cups, laughing, living normal lives, and for a second, it felt unreal that just an hour ago, I had been in a hospital bed being told I had lost my baby, and now I was just another car in traffic, another person passing by. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, neat, quiet, the porch light still on even though it was early afternoon, and that sameness made something in my chest tighten again, because I knew what was waiting inside. Daniel turned off the engine but did not move right away. His hand stayed on the wheel for a few seconds longer, and then he exhaled slowly, like he was preparing himself. I opened the door before he could say anything, the cool air hitting my face, and I walked toward the front door without looking back. The moment I stepped inside, I could hear voices in the kitchen, low, familiar. His mother had come back before us. Of course she had. She always moved faster than everyone else when it came to controlling a situation. I paused for just a second in the hallway, listening, not on purpose, but because their voices carried clearly. "She needs to see a specialist," his mother was saying, her tone calm, practical, like she was discussing a minor inconvenience. "We cannot let this happen again." There was a brief pause, and then Daniel's voice, quieter. "It was not her fault," he said, but there was no firmness behind it, no weight, just a sentence placed gently on the table, easily ignored. His mother sighed softly. "Daniel, you are too kind," she replied. "But kindness does not build a family." I felt my fingers tighten slightly against the wall beside me. Not enough to make a sound, just enough for me to notice. "You need to think about the future," she continued, "about what kind of life you want." There was another pause, longer this time, and I found myself holding my breath without realizing it, waiting. And then he said it, not loudly, not angrily, just quietly. I know, 2 simple words, but they settled in my chest heavier than anything she had said earlier. Because they were not directed at me. They were not meant for me to hear. They were honest in a way he had never been with me, and in that moment, something became very clear, clearer than it had ever been before. I stepped into the kitchen then, not making a big entrance, just walking in like I had every right to be there, which I did. His mother turned her head slightly when she saw me, her expression unchanged, composed, almost polite, like the conversation we had just had in the hospital had never happened. "You should rest," she said, her voice softer now, adjusted, controlled. "Your body needs time." I nodded once, not trusting my voice yet. Daniel glanced at me briefly and then looked away again. And that small movement told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. The house felt different that afternoon. Not physically. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. But the air felt heavier, like every room held something unsaid. I walked upstairs slowly, each step deliberate, my body still weak, my head still light, and when I reached the bedroom, I stopped in the doorway. The crib box was still leaning against the wall, unopened. The small bag of baby clothes I had bought 2 weeks ago was still sitting on the chair, untouched. And for a second, I just stood there, looking at it all, my vision slightly blurred, not from tears but from the weight of it. I walked over to the chair and picked up the bag, my fingers brushing over the soft fabric inside, tiny, light, something that suddenly felt very far away. I sat down on the edge of the bed and placed the bag beside me, my hands resting on my knees. And that was when the silence finally caught up to me. Not the silence in the hospital, not the silence in the car, but a deeper one, the kind that settles in your chest and stays there. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows on my thighs, my head lowered, and I let out a slow breath, my shoulders trembling just a little, not enough to be dramatic, just enough to release something that had been building all day. I did not cry loudly. There were no sobs, no breakdown, just quiet tears that came and went, like waves that did not need to be seen. Minutes passed, maybe more. I did not check the time, and eventually, I stood up again, walked to the bathroom, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red but steady, my expression calm in a way that surprised me, and that was when I noticed something else. Something small but important. I did not look broken. I looked clear, like something had shifted into place. I walked back into the bedroom and sat at the small desk near the window, my laptop still there, closed, exactly where I had left it the night before. I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over it, and then I opened it, the screen lighting up the dim room, familiar, quiet, and without thinking too much about it, I clicked on the folder I had created months ago, the one I had never told anyone about, labeled simply with my initials. Inside were documents, plans, emails, things I had been building slowly, carefully. In the background of a life that now felt like it no longer belonged to me, I stared at the screen for a moment, my mind still catching up, and then I did something small, almost insignificant. I opened a new email and replied to a client who had reached out the week before, my fingers moving slowly at first, then more steadily. The words simple, professional, clear, and as I hit send, I felt something shift again. Not a big moment, not a dramatic decision, just a quiet step forward. But it was mine, and for the first time that day, I felt a sense of control, faint but real. Downstairs, I could still hear faint voices, conversations continuing without me, decisions being discussed as if I were not part of them. But upstairs, in that small space, with that soft glow from the laptop, something else was beginning, something they did not see, something they did not understand, and something they would not be able to stop once it started. The next morning felt almost normal, and that was what made it so strange. The sunlight came through the curtains the same way it always did, soft and steady, casting long shadows across the floor, and for a few seconds after I opened my eyes, I forgot where I was, what had happened. I just lay there, listening to the quiet hum of the house. But then it all came back at once, not as a loud realization, but as a quiet weight settling back into place. I turned my head slightly and saw the empty space beside me, the sheets smooth, untouched. Daniel had already left the room, or maybe he had not come back at all. I could not remember hearing him during the night. I sat up slowly, my body still heavy, still not fully mine, and rested my feet on the floor, the cold wood grounding me in a way nothing else did. Downstairs, I could hear movement, cabinets opening and closing, the faint clink of dishes, and voices, always voices. I stayed where I was for a minute, just breathing, letting myself wake up fully before stepping back into that world. Then I stood, walked to the bathroom, and caught my reflection again. My face looked the same as yesterday, maybe a little paler, but steady, controlled, like I had already decided something, even if I had not said it out loud yet. I washed my face, tied my hair back, and went downstairs. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast, and his mother was standing at the counter, already dressed, already composed, like she had stepped into a new day without carrying anything from the one before. Daniel was sitting at the table, scrolling on his phone, His posture relaxed in a way that felt distant, disconnected. When they both looked up at me, there was a brief pause, just long enough to notice. "You should eat something," his mother said, her tone even, almost gentle, but there was something underneath it, something measured, like she was choosing each word carefully. I nodded and walked toward the counter, poured myself a glass of water instead, my stomach not ready for anything else. Daniel glanced at me, opened his mouth slightly like he was about to say something, then closed it again, his eyes dropping back to his phone. And that small hesitation told me more than any sentence could have. The conversation at the table continued around me, plans, schedules, things that needed to be done, and I stood there, present but not included, like a background figure in my own life. At one point, his mother mentioned calling a specialist, her voice calm, practical, outlining next steps as if this was simply a problem to be solved. "We should not wait too long," she said. "The sooner we understand what went wrong, the better." I felt my grip tighten slightly around the glass, not enough to draw attention, just enough for me to feel it. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, that makes sense," he replied. And there it was again, that quiet agreement, that absence of anything that sounded like defense, like partnership, like standing beside me instead of somewhere just behind his mother's words. I placed the glass down gently and turned away, moving toward the hallway without interrupting, without adding anything, because I already knew how this would go. I had seen this pattern before. The decisions would be made, the expectations would be set, and I would be expected to follow them, to adjust, to try harder, to fix something that was never mine, to fix alone. Back upstairs, the room felt smaller than it had the night before, or maybe I just saw it more clearly now. I walked to the desk and opened my laptop again, not hesitating this time. The screen came to life quickly, and the folder was still there, waiting. I clicked through the files, reviewing the work I had done over the past few months, small contracts, outlines, numbers that had once felt insignificant but now looked different, more solid, more real. There was an email notification. A reply from the client I had answered the night before. I opened it, my eyes scanning the message carefully. They wanted to move forward. They were asking about timelines, about availability, about next steps. And for a moment, I just stared at the screen, letting that sink in. It was a simple opportunity, nothing dramatic, nothing life-changing on its own, but it was something I had created, something that existed outside of this house, outside of their expectations, outside of their definition of who I was supposed to be. I straightened slightly in my chair, my fingers resting on the keyboard, and began typing a response, outlining a clear plan, setting boundaries, using a tone that felt different from the way I spoke downstairs, more certain, more direct, more myself. When I finished, I read it once more, made a small adjustment, and hit send. And again, that quiet shift inside me, subtle but undeniable, as if each small action was placing another piece into something larger, something I could not fully see yet but could feel forming. Time passed without me noticing. The house continued its rhythm below. Footsteps, voices, the occasional sound of a door opening or closing, but none of it reached me the same way it had before. It felt distant now, like I was already stepping slightly outside of it. Later that afternoon, Daniel came into the room. He stood near the door for a second before speaking. "My mom scheduled an appointment," he said, his voice neutral, like he was delivering information, not asking, not discussing. I looked at him, really looked at him, noticing the way he avoided holding my gaze for too long. "I am not going," I said quietly, the words simple, steady, and the moment they left my mouth, I felt the air in the room shift. He frowned slightly, surprised. "What do you mean?" he asked, not angry, just confused. Like this response did not fit into the version of me he was used to. I held his gaze this time, not aggressively, just firmly. "I mean, I am not going," I repeated. There was a pause, a longer one this time, and I could see him trying to process it, trying to find the right response. But for once, I did not fill the silence for him. I did not soften it. I let it sit exactly where it was, because for the first time, I was not trying to make this easier for anyone else. And in that quiet moment, something became clear, not just to me, but to him as well, that the version of me who would have nodded, agreed, adjusted without question, was no longer standing in that room. Daniel did not argue right away, and that was what made the moment feel different. He just stood there, his hand still resting lightly on the doorframe, his eyes searching my face like he was trying to find the version of me he understood, the one who would explain, who would soften her words, who would eventually give in, but I did not do any of those things. I just sat there, my hands resting calmly on the desk, my posture steady, and for a few seconds, the room was completely silent. "Olivia," he finally said, his voice lower now, careful, "this is important." I did not respond immediately, not because I did not have anything to say, but because I wanted him to feel the space, to notice that something had shifted. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the slight tension in his jaw, the uncertainty in his eyes, and I realized that for the first time, he did not know how this conversation was going to go. "Important for who?" I asked quietly, the words simple, but they seemed to land harder than I expected. He blinked, caught off guard, like he had not considered that question before. "For us," he replied after a moment, but even as he said it, there was hesitation, like he was repeating something he had heard, rather than something he fully believed. I nodded slightly, not agreeing, just acknowledging. "It does not feel like us," I said, my voice still calm, still controlled, and again, silence. Heavier this time, because there was no easy way to move past what I had just said. He shifted his weight slightly, stepping further into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "You are going through a lot right now," he said, his tone gentler, almost careful. "You might not be thinking clearly." And there it was, that familiar pattern, not direct blame, not harsh words, but a quiet dismissal, a way to make my response seem temporary, emotional, something that could be corrected later. I felt a small, almost unnoticeable exhale leave my chest, not frustration, not anger, just recognition. "I am thinking more clearly than I have in a long time," I replied, and this time I did not look away. I held his gaze, steady, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, not yet, but something close to discomfort, like the ground beneath him had shifted slightly. "So you are just going to ignore this?" he asked, his voice tightening just a little. "Ignore what happened?" I tilted my head slightly, considering his words. "I am not ignoring what happened," I said. "I am choosing what happens next." And that was when the conversation changed. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, in the way his expression hardened slightly, because this was no longer a discussion he could guide. It was something he could not control. "My mom is trying to help," he said more firmly now. "She is worried about us." I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but out of the quiet clarity of it. "She is worried about control," I said softly, and the moment the words left my mouth, I knew there was no going back to the way things had been before. His eyes narrowed slightly, not aggressively, but defensively. "That is not fair," he said, and there was a hint of frustration now finally surfacing. "You know how she is." I nodded once. "Yes," I said, "I do." And that was the problem, because for a long time, I had told myself the same thing, that this was just how she was, that I needed to adjust, to be patient, to not take things personally. But now, sitting there, looking at him, I realized something else, something I had avoided admitting before, that knowing how someone is does not mean you have to accept how they treat you, and more importantly, it does not mean the person who chose you gets to stand silently beside it. "You could have said something," I added quietly, not accusing, just stating it, and that seemed to land differently than anything else, because he did not respond right away. His gaze dropped slightly, his lips pressing together, as if he was searching for an answer that would make sense, but there was none, not one that would undo what had already happened. "It was not the right time," he said finally, and even he seemed to hear how weak that sounded, the words hanging in the air between us. Thin, unconvincing. I did not argue. I did not push. I just nodded slowly. "It never is," I said. And that was the truth of it, not just in that moment, but in all the moments before, the small ones, the ones that had built up quietly over time. Each time he chose silence. Each time I told myself it was not worth making it bigger. Each time I made myself smaller to keep things smooth. And now, sitting here, I could see the pattern clearly, like looking at something from a distance for the first time. "Olivia," he said again. Softer now, like he was trying to find a different approach. "We can figure this out." And for a second, I almost wanted to believe him, not because of what he was saying, but because of what it would mean if it were true, that things could still be fixed, that we could still be on the same side. But then I remembered the hospital room, the silence, the way he had looked away, and I realized that what we needed to figure out was not what he thought it was. "I already am," I said quietly, and that seemed to confuse him more than anything else, his brows pulling together slightly. "What does that mean?" he asked, and I looked at him, really looked, taking in the man I had built a life with, the man I had trusted, the man who now stood in front of me, unsure of who I was becoming. "It means I am not waiting anymore," I said, each word steady, deliberate, and I could see it then, the moment it registered, not fully, not yet, but enough to create a shift in the air between us, something subtle but irreversible, like a door that had been closed quietly but firmly, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to open it again. After he left the room, the silence did not feel heavy anymore. It felt clear, like something had finally been said that could not be taken back. I stayed in my chair for a few seconds, my eyes resting on the closed door, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway and then disappear into the background noise of the house, voices, movement, a life continuing without pausing for what had just shifted upstairs. I turned back to my laptop slowly, my fingers resting on the edge of the desk, and for the first time since the hospital, I did not feel like I was reacting to something. I felt like I was choosing something, and that difference was small, but it changed everything. I opened my inbox again, reread the client message from earlier, and this time, I did not just respond, I expanded. I outlined a full proposal, structured, detailed, confident, my mind moving faster now, clearer, connecting ideas that had been sitting quietly in the background for months. Things I had once treated as possibilities now felt like plans, real, actionable, mine. The more I typed, the more the room seemed to fade around me, the noise downstairs becoming distant, irrelevant, and for a moment, I forgot where I was entirely. I was not in that house. I was not in that role. I was somewhere else, building something that belonged only to me. When I finally leaned back in my chair, my shoulders relaxed slightly, not from exhaustion, but from a quiet sense of alignment. Something inside me had clicked into place. I closed my eyes briefly, just for a second, and when I opened them again, the room came back into focus. The same walls, the same furniture, the same life, but it no longer felt permanent. It felt temporary, like a place I was passing through, rather than a place I was rooted in. There was a knock on the door, soft but firm. I did not need to guess who it was. "Olivia," his mother's voice came through, controlled, measured. I stood up slowly and walked to the door, opening it just enough to face her. She stood there, perfectly composed, her posture straight, her expression neutral in a way that looked almost polite if you did not know her well. "We need to talk," she said, her tone calm, but there was something underneath it, something firm, like this was not a request. I stepped aside slightly, letting her in without a word. She walked into the room with quiet confidence, her eyes scanning briefly, taking in the space, the desk, the laptop, the small details that most people would overlook, but not her, never her. She turned to face me again, her hands lightly clasped in front of her. "Daniel told me you refused the appointment," she said, not accusing, just stating it. I nodded once, not elaborating. She watched me for a moment, studying my face like she was trying to read something deeper, something she had not seen before. "I understand that you are emotional right now," she continued, her voice steady, almost gentle. "But decisions like this should not be made from a place of hurt." I did not respond immediately. I let her finish. I let the words settle in the room, and then I spoke. "This is not about hurt," I said quietly, and that seemed to shift something in her expression, just slightly, a small tightening around her eyes, like she had expected resistance, but not this kind, not this calm. She took a small step closer, her tone adjusting, becoming firmer, more direct. "Then what is it about?" she asked, and I held her gaze, not challenging, not defensive, just steady. "It is about me," I said, and for a second the room felt very still. Because that answer did not fit into the structure she was used to. It was not about the family, not about expectations, not about what needed to be fixed or improved. It was something outside of that system entirely. She straightened slightly, her posture becoming more rigid. "You are part of this family," she said. And there it was, the underlying message, the boundary she believed I could not step outside of. I nodded slowly. I replied, and the moment the word left my mouth, I saw it, the first real crack in her composure. Not a dramatic reaction, not anger, but a subtle shift, like something had moved in a direction she had not anticipated. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice lower now, more controlled, but with a hint of something else beneath it, something sharper. I did not rush to answer. I let the silence sit for a moment, not as a tactic, but because I wanted the words to be exactly what I meant. "It means I am not going to stay in a place where I am only valued for what I can give you," I said, and this time there was no mistaking the reaction. Her lips pressed together slightly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in anger, but in calculation, like she was reassessing something, adjusting her understanding of the situation. "You are misunderstanding," she said after a moment, her tone smoothing out again, controlled, practiced. "Everything we do is for the good of the family." I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was so familiar, so consistent, the same reasoning, the same justification, repeated in different forms over time. "Not my good," I said softly. And that was the line, the one that separated everything before from everything after. The room felt different now, heavier in a new way, not with tension, but with finality. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. And then she spoke again, more slowly this time. "You are making a mistake," she said, and for the first time, there was no softness in her voice, no attempt to frame it as concern, just a statement, clear and direct. I nodded once, accepting that she believed that. "Maybe," I replied, "but it will be my mistake." And that was something she could not argue with, not directly, because it did not fit into her structure of control. There was a long pause after that, and then she turned slightly, her gaze moving briefly toward the desk, the laptop still open, the faint glow of the screen visible from where she stood, and for a second, something flickered in her eyes, curiosity, maybe suspicion. I did not move. I did not explain. I just stood there, letting her see what she could see, and nothing more, because what she did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had already started building a life that did not require their approval, and that realization was not loud, not dramatic, but it was solid, steady, and completely mine. She did not say anything else after that, not immediately. She just stood there for a few seconds longer, her eyes still on me, as if she was waiting for something, maybe for me to correct myself, to soften what I had just said, to step back into the role she understood. But I did not move. I did not fill the silence, and eventually she turned and walked toward the door, her steps controlled, measured, as if nothing had truly shifted, but I could feel it, in the air, in the space she left behind. Something had changed in a way that could not be undone. The door closed quietly behind her, and for a moment, I stood there alone, listening to the faint sounds of the house continuing below, the same rhythm, the same voices, but now it all felt distant, like I was already stepping outside of it. I walked back to the desk slowly and sat down, my eyes drifting to the laptop screen again, still open, still waiting, and this time, I did not hesitate. I moved forward, opening new tabs, reviewing numbers, checking timelines. Things that had once felt like small side projects now felt like something much bigger, something real. Hours passed without me noticing, the light in the room shifting gradually as the afternoon turned into early evening, and at some point, I realized I had not thought about the conversation downstairs, or the hospital, or anything they had said, not because it did not matter, but because for the first time, it was not the center of everything, and that realization felt strange, but also freeing. Later that evening, I went downstairs again, not out of obligation, but because I needed water. The kitchen was quieter now, the light softer, and Daniel was sitting alone at the table, his phone in front of him, untouched. He looked up when I walked in, his expression more serious now, less uncertain, like he had spent the last few hours thinking. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady, I paused for a second, then nodded slightly, walking over and sitting across from him. The space between us felt different now, not just physically, but in a way that was harder to define, like there was something unspoken sitting there with us, something that neither of us could ignore anymore. "My mom is upset," he started, and I noticed immediately that he began with her, not with me, not with us, but with her. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about where his focus still was. I did not interrupt. I let him continue. "She thinks you are making decisions too quickly," he added, his eyes watching me carefully, like he was trying to predict how I would react. I nodded once, not agreeing, just acknowledging. "And what do you think?" I asked quietly. And that question seemed to catch him off guard again, like he was not used to being asked directly, like he was more comfortable relaying someone else's perspective than forming his own. He leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I think we should take some time," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Figure things out together?" And for a brief moment, I felt that familiar pull, the one that made me want to believe him, to return to something stable, something known. But then I remembered the hospital, the silence, the way he had stood there, and I realized that what he was offering now was not a solution, it was a delay. "Together," I repeated softly, and he nodded. Encouraged by the word, "Yes," he said, "we can fix this." I looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, the sincerity in his expression, the way he truly believed that things could be repaired if we just approached them the right way. And for a second, I almost envied that ability to see things as something that could be adjusted, managed, controlled. But my experience had shown me something different, something quieter, something less flexible. "What exactly are we fixing?" I asked, and this time there was no confusion in my tone, just clarity, and again, silence, because that question did not have an easy answer, not one that could be said out loud without acknowledging everything that had been avoided until now. He looked down briefly, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table, a small, restless movement. "What happened?" he said finally, his voice lower now. "The situation." I nodded slowly, understanding what he meant, but also understanding what he was leaving out. "What happened is not something we can fix," I said. "It is something we went through." And that distinction seemed to land somewhere between us, not fully understood, but felt. He frowned slightly, leaning forward again. "So what are you saying?" he asked. And I met his gaze, steady, calm. "I am saying I am not going to spend the next part of my life trying to prove something to people who already decided what I am worth." And as I said it, I could feel how true it was, not just as a statement, but as something settled inside me, something that had been forming quietly for a long time and had now finally taken shape. He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief, like he was trying to reconcile this version of me with the one he had known. "You are overreacting," he said, and there it was again, that quiet dismissal, softer than his mother's words, but rooted in the same place. And this time, I did not feel hurt by it. I just recognized it. "No," I replied gently. "I am reacting for the first time." And that seemed to stop him completely, the words hanging in the air between us, simple but final. He leaned back again, his expression shifting, the tension in his face more visible now, because this was no longer a conversation he could guide or control. It was something moving in a direction he did not expect. "So what happens now?" he asked after a long pause, and I took a slow breath, my hands resting calmly on the table, my posture steady. "Now," I said, "I focus on what comes next for me." And as the words left my mouth, I realized something else, something quiet but powerful, that I was no longer asking for permission, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to wait for his response. He did not answer right away, and for the first time, it was not because he was avoiding the conversation, it was because he genuinely did not know what to say. I could see it in the way his eyes shifted slightly, in the way his fingers stopped tapping against the table, in the way his posture lost that quiet certainty it had always carried. And in that moment, I realized something I had not fully seen before, that he had never expected me to reach this point. Not really. He had expected me to bend, to adjust, to eventually come back to a place that felt familiar to him. But I was not there anymore, and I could see that realization settling in slowly, not all at once, but piece by piece, like something becoming clearer with each second of silence. "You are serious," he said finally, his voice lower now, more careful, and I nodded once, not dramatically, just enough to confirm what he was already beginning to understand. "Yes," I replied, and that single word seemed to carry more weight than anything else I had said so far, because it left no room for interpretation, no space for negotiation, just a quiet, steady truth. He leaned back in his chair again, running a hand through his hair, a small gesture that I had seen many times before, usually when he was stressed. But this felt different, less about the situation, more about something internal, something shifting in a way he could not control. "So what are you going to do?" he asked, and there was something else in his voice now, something that sounded almost like uncertainty, like he was trying to understand a version of the future that did not include the assumptions he had always relied on. I did not answer immediately, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to say it clearly, without hesitation, without softening it to make it easier for him to hear. "I am going to leave," I said, and the words landed between us with a kind of quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. His eyes widened slightly, not in shock exactly, but in recognition, like a moment he had not wanted to imagine had suddenly become real. "Leave," he repeated, and I nodded again. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I am not staying here." There was a long pause after that, longer than any silence we had shared so far, and I could feel the weight of it, not pressing down on me, but existing in the space between us, something that both of us had to sit with. "You cannot just walk away," he said finally, his tone shifting again, firmer now, like he was trying to reestablish something, some kind of structure. And I looked at him, not with defiance, not with anger, just with clarity. "I can," I replied softly. And that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, because it was not a challenge, it was a statement, calm, grounded, and completely certain. He shook his head slightly, his brows pulling together. "That is not how this works," he said. And I noticed the way he said it, like there were rules, expectations, a system that I was supposed to follow, and for a long time, I had, without question, without resistance. But now, sitting there, I realized something simple, something that had been hidden under all those expectations, that those rules only worked if I agreed to them, and I no longer did. "It is how it works for me," I said. And again, that quiet shift in the room, subtle but irreversible. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table now, more engaged, more focused. "Olivia, this is not just about you," he said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice now, not loud, but present. "We are married." I nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that. "We are," I said, "but that does not mean I stop being a person." And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt something settle inside me even more firmly. Because this was not just about leaving a place, it was about reclaiming something I had slowly given away without realizing it, my sense of self, my ability to choose, my right to exist outside of someone else's expectations. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression shifting between frustration and something else, something quieter, something closer to confusion, like he was trying to understand how things had changed so much without him noticing. "When did this happen?" he asked, almost to himself, and I could have answered that in many ways. I could have pointed to the hospital, to his mother's words, to his silence. But the truth was, it had started long before that, in small moments, quiet realizations, things that had built over time until they could no longer be ignored. "It did not happen all at once," I said softly, and he nodded slightly, as if that made sense, even if he did not fully understand it. There was another pause, and then he asked, "And what about us?" And this time, there was something different in his voice, something more personal, less structured, less influenced by everything else. And for a second, I felt it, the weight of that question, not just as a relationship, but as a history, as everything we had built together, the memories, the plans, the version of the future we had once imagined. But then I looked at him, really looked, and I saw the same pattern, the same silence, the same distance, and I knew that whatever we had been, it was not something that could carry me forward from here. "I do not know what we are anymore," I said honestly, and that was the truth. Not a dramatic ending, Not a clear break, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had already changed beyond recognition. He exhaled slowly, leaning back again, his eyes dropping to the table, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the house around us quiet, the world outside, continuing as if nothing had shifted. But in that space, between those few words, everything had already begun to move in a different direction, and for the first time, I was not afraid of where it might lead. That night, I did not pack everything. I did not make a scene. I did not even say goodbye. I simply went upstairs, closed the bedroom door quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The house felt the same, but I did not, and that difference was enough. I stood up slowly and walked toward the closet, opening it without hesitation, my hands moving with a kind of calm focus that surprised even me. I reached for a small suitcase, the one I used for short trips, and placed it on the bed, not because I could not take more, but because I did not need to. I started with the basics, a few changes of clothes, simple, practical, nothing sentimental, nothing that tied me too closely to this place. Each item folded neatly, placed inside with care, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate, as if I had already accepted that this was happening, as if some part of me had been preparing for this long before I allowed myself to admit it. I paused for a second when I reached the dresser, my fingers resting lightly on the handle, and then I opened it. Inside were things I had not touched in weeks. Small reminders of a life that had been moving in a different direction. I picked up one of the baby outfits I had bought. Soft fabric, pale colors, something I had once held with quiet excitement, and for a moment, I just stood there holding it, my chest tightening slightly, not with overwhelming grief, but with something quieter, deeper, something that did not need to be expressed out loud. I placed it back gently, closing the drawer without taking anything from it, because I understood now that I was not just leaving a place, I was leaving a version of myself that had been shaped by expectations I no longer believed in. I turned back to the bed, zipped the suitcase halfway, and sat down again, my hands resting on top of it. The room felt still, almost peaceful, in a way it had not before, and that calm told me I was making the right decision. Downstairs, I could hear faint movement, a door closing, footsteps, voices lowered. But no one came upstairs, no one knocked, and I realized that even now, in this moment, I was still not being seen in the way that mattered. And strangely, that did not hurt anymore. It just confirmed what I already knew. I stood up again and walked to the desk, opening my laptop one more time, the screen lighting up softly in the dim room. I checked my email quickly. Another response had come in, a follow-up from the same client, confirming the next steps, asking for availability, and I replied without hesitation. My words clear, confident, outlining a schedule that did not include this house, did not include waiting, did not include asking for permission. When I hit send, I felt it again, that quiet shift, stronger this time, like each small action was reinforcing something new, something solid. I closed the laptop gently and looked around the room one last time, not searching for memories, not holding on to anything, just observing, acknowledging what had been, and then letting it go. I reached for my purse, slipped my phone inside, and stood there for a second longer, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed, and then I picked up the suitcase, the weight of it light, manageable, exactly what I needed. I walked toward the door, opened it slowly, and stepped into the hallway. The house was quieter now, the lights dimmer, and as I moved down the stairs, each step felt steady, grounded, like I was not leaving in a rush, but moving forward with intention. When I reached the bottom, I saw Daniel in the living room, standing near the window, his back partially turned. He looked up when he heard me, his eyes immediately dropping to the suitcase in my hand, and for a second, neither of us spoke. The moment stretched out, quiet, heavy with everything that had already been said. "You are really leaving," he said finally, his voice low, not surprised, just acknowledging. I nodded once, not adding anything more, because there was nothing left to explain. He took a small step forward, like he might say something else, but then he stopped, his expression shifting, uncertainty, hesitation, and something else, something that looked almost like regret. But it was too late for that to change anything. I held his gaze for a moment, not with anger, not with blame, just with clarity, and then I turned toward the front door, my hand reaching for the handle. I paused for just a second, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel the moment fully, to recognize it for what it was. Not an escape, not a loss, but a decision, my decision. And then I opened the door, the cool night air meeting me immediately. Fresh, open, different from the stillness inside, I stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me with a soft click. And as I walked down the driveway, the suitcase rolling lightly beside me, I did not look back, not once, because I already knew that everything I needed was in front of me, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I did not go far that first night, not because I could not, but because I did not need to. I checked into a small hotel about 10 miles away, just off the highway, the kind of place people usually pass without noticing. But for me, it felt exactly right, quiet, simple, anonymous. The room was clean but plain. A single bed, a small desk near the window, a soft lamp casting a warm glow in the corner, and when I closed the door behind me, the silence felt different from the silence I had left behind. It was not heavy. It was not filled with unspoken tension. It was just still. I placed my suitcase on the floor, set my purse on the desk, and stood there for a moment, taking it in, not as an escape, but as a beginning. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. A few cars scattered under dim lights, nothing remarkable, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle inside me, something quiet but steady, like my life had finally shifted back into my own hands. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing slightly, and then I reached for my phone. Not to call anyone, not to explain, just to check the time. It was later than I expected. The day had stretched in a way that made it feel longer than it was, and for a second, I wondered if Daniel would call, if there would be messages. Questions? Something that tried to pull me back into the conversation I had just left. But when I unlocked the screen, there was nothing. No missed calls, no texts, just the quiet confirmation that I had truly stepped outside of that space. I placed the phone face down on the desk and opened my laptop again, the familiar glow filling the room, and I returned to the work I had started earlier, reviewing the proposal, refining details, adjusting timelines. My mind focused in a way that felt almost surprising after everything that had happened, but it made sense, because this was the one part of my life that had been growing steadily, untouched by everything else, and now, without the noise, without the constant pressure to be something I was not, it felt clearer, stronger. I worked for a while, not watching the clock, not thinking about anything beyond what was in front of me, and when I finally leaned back, I realized how different this felt from the life I had been living just hours before. There was no tension in my chest, no anticipation of someone else's reaction, no need to measure my words or adjust my behavior. It was just me, in a quiet room, making decisions for myself, and that simplicity felt powerful in a way I had not expected. The next morning, I woke up early, the light coming through the thin curtains, softer than the one at the house, and for a moment, I forgot where I was again. But this time, when the memory returned, it did not bring that same weight. It felt lighter, more distant, like something I had already stepped away from. I sat up slowly, my body still adjusting, still healing, but my mind steady, focused. I reached for my phone again, and this time there was a message, just one, from Daniel. It was short, simple. We need to talk. I stared at it for a second, my thumb hovering over the screen, not reacting immediately, not feeling the urgency I might have felt before. And then I locked the phone again, placing it back on the desk without replying, because I understood now that not every conversation needed to happen right away. Not every request needed to be answered on someone else's timeline. I got dressed slowly, choosing comfortable clothes, nothing complicated, nothing that required effort beyond what I needed, and then I sat back down at the desk, opening my laptop again. There was another email, a new inquiry this time, someone referred by the client I had spoken to the day before, asking about my services, asking about availability, and I read it carefully, a small, almost unnoticeable smile forming as I realized what it meant, that this was not just a single opportunity, it was something growing, something expanding, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see it fully, not as a backup plan, not as something temporary, but as something real, something that could stand on its own. I replied to the message, my tone confident, my words clear, setting boundaries, outlining terms, and as I typed, I could feel that same quiet certainty building again, stronger now, more defined. This was not something I was trying anymore. This was something I was doing, and that difference mattered. Hours passed again, but this time I noticed them, not as something slipping away, but as something I was choosing how to use. I took breaks when I needed to, drank water, rested, listening to what my body needed instead of pushing through for someone else's expectations, and in those small choices, I felt a kind of control I had not realized I had been missing. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside briefly, the air cooler than I expected, a light breeze moving through the parking lot, and I stood there for a moment, looking out at the road, cars passing by, people moving through their own lives, and I realized something else, something simple but important, that my life did not have to return to what it had been. It could move forward, in a different direction, one that I chose, one that I built. And for the first time, that idea did not feel uncertain. It felt possible, real. And as I walked back into the room, closing the door behind me, I knew that whatever came next, I was no longer standing in the same place I had been before, and I was not going back. By the third day, the silence between me and my old life had stretched into something permanent, not fragile, not uncertain, but steady, like a line that had already been crossed and could not be uncrossed. I woke up before my alarm, the early morning light filtering softly through the curtains, and for a moment I just lay there, listening to the quiet, not waiting for anything, not anticipating anyone, just existing in a space that belonged entirely to me. My phone was still on the desk, where I had left it the night before, and when I picked it up, there were more messages now. 3 from Daniel, spaced out over the last 24 hours, each one short, each one trying a different approach. The first still practical, we need to figure this out. The second more personal, can we talk? And the last one, sent late at night, simply said, I am worried about you. I read them once slowly, letting the words settle without reacting immediately, and then I placed the phone back down, not deleting them, not responding, just choosing not to step back into that conversation yet, because I understood now that urgency was not always real. Sometimes it was just pressure, and I was no longer moving under that. I got up, moved through my morning quietly, showering, getting dressed, making a simple cup of coffee with the small machine in the room, the routine grounding me in a way I had not felt in a long time. And when I sat down at the desk again, opening my laptop, it felt natural, not like an escape, but like a continuation. My inbox had grown overnight, 2 more inquiries, one from a small business owner, another from someone who had seen my work through a referral, and I read each message carefully, noticing how my reaction had changed. There was no hesitation, no doubt about whether I could handle it, just a calm assessment of what I wanted to take on, what fit into the direction I was building. I replied to both, setting clear expectations, outlining timelines that worked for me, not for anyone else, and as I typed, I realized something else, something subtle but important, that I was no longer asking for approval, not from them, not from anyone, I was deciding, and that shift made everything feel different. Around noon, my phone buzzed again, this time a call, Daniel's name appearing on the screen. I watched it for a few seconds, the sound filling the quiet room, and for a moment, I considered answering, not because I felt pulled back, but because I wanted to see what he would say. But then I let it ring until it stopped, not as a statement, not as a punishment, just as a choice, because I did not need to respond right away. A few seconds later, a message followed. Please just tell me you are okay. And I read it once, then locked the phone again, placing it face down on the desk, because I understood that being okay was not something I needed to explain to him anymore. It was something I needed to define for myself. The afternoon passed with the same steady rhythm, work, small breaks, moments of stillness, and in those hours, I felt something continue to build, not just the business, but something inside me, a sense of direction, of control, of clarity that had been missing for so long. Later that day, I stepped out again, walking a little farther this time, past the edge of the parking lot, down a short stretch of sidewalk that led to a small coffee shop across the street. The bell above the door rang softly as I stepped inside, the smell of coffee and warm pastries filling the space, and for a moment, I just stood there, taking it in. The quiet conversations, the soft music playing in the background, people sitting alone or in small groups, each one in their own world. And it struck me how ordinary it all was, how simple, and yet how different it felt to be here on my own terms. I ordered a coffee, took a seat near the window, and opened my laptop again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The work flowed easily, naturally, and as I sat there, I realized that this was what I had been missing. Not just independence, but the ability to exist without constantly adjusting to someone else's expectations, without measuring myself against a standard that was never truly mine. When I returned to the hotel that evening, there was another message waiting, this one different, longer, from Daniel. I opened it slowly, reading each line carefully. He wrote about the house feeling empty, about his mother asking questions he did not know how to answer, about not understanding how things had reached this point. And for the first time, I felt something shift, not in a way that pulled me back, but in a way that clarified something else, that he was just beginning to see what I had been living with for much longer, that the distance he felt now was something I had felt in smaller ways. Over time, building quietly until it could no longer be ignored, I closed the message without replying, not because I did not care, but because I understood that this was not something that could be resolved with words alone. Not now, maybe not ever. I placed the phone down and sat back in my chair, my eyes drifting to the window. The sky outside darker now, the lights from the parking lot casting soft reflections on the glass. And in that moment, I felt a kind of calm settle over me. Not the kind that comes from everything being solved, but the kind that comes from knowing you are no longer standing in the same place, that whatever comes next will be something you choose. And as I turned back to my laptop, opening a new document, outlining the next steps for the work I was building, I realized that this was no longer about leaving something behind. It was about moving forward into something that was entirely mine. And for the first time, that felt not just possible, but certain. A week passed, and then another. And somewhere in those quiet, steady days, my life stopped feeling like something I had stepped away from and started feeling like something I had stepped into. The hotel room became less of a temporary space and more of a transition, a place where everything was still simple, still contained, but no longer uncertain. I had moved to a small apartment by then, nothing extravagant, just a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a quiet building, about 15 minutes from downtown. The walls were plain, the furniture minimal, but every corner of it felt different from the house I had left behind, not because of how it looked, but because of what it represented. There were no expectations built into the space, no silent rules shaping how I moved or what I said. It was just mine. The first morning I woke up there, the light came through the blinds in thin lines across the floor, and I remember standing barefoot in the middle of the room, holding a cup of coffee, just looking around, not searching for anything, just taking it in, and for a moment, I felt something settle inside me, something quiet and steady, like I had finally arrived somewhere I had been moving toward for a long time without realizing it. My work had grown faster than I expected, not in a sudden, overwhelming way, but steadily, consistently, each new client connecting to another, each project building on the last, and what started as something small had become something structured, something real. I had set up a dedicated workspace by the window, a simple desk, my laptop, a notebook, and a calendar where I tracked everything, deadlines, meetings, ideas, and each time I sat down there, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. It came from me, from what I was creating, from the way I was choosing to build my life. Daniel had continued to reach out, not constantly, not in a way that felt overwhelming, but consistently enough to remind me that he was still there, still trying to understand. His messages had changed over time, less focused on fixing things, more focused on asking questions, on trying to connect in a way he had not before, and I read them, all of them, not ignoring, not dismissing, but also not rushing to respond, because I understood now that communication was not the same as resolution, and I was not ready to step back into something that had not truly changed. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after I left, I received a message that felt different, Not because of what it said, but because of how it was written. It was longer, more direct, less structured. "I went back to the hospital," he wrote. "I talked to the doctor. I asked questions I should have asked before, and I realized something I did not see then." I read that line twice, slowly, letting it settle. "I should have been there for you," the message continued. "Not just physically, but actually there, and I was not." I sat back in my chair, my eyes lingering on the screen, not feeling pulled back, not feeling undone, just aware that something had shifted on his side, that he was beginning to see what I had already lived through. And for a moment, I felt a small, quiet ache, not because I wanted to go back, but because I understood how different things might have been if that realization had come earlier. I did not respond right away. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the street below, people moving through their day, cars passing by, life continuing in its steady rhythm, and I realized something else in that moment, something that felt important, that understanding what had happened did not change what had already been done. It did not erase the silence. It did not undo the way I had been made to feel, and more importantly, it did not change the direction I was now moving in. Later that evening, I opened the laptop again and read the message once more, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, and then I typed a response, slowly, carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. "I hear you," I wrote, keeping the words simple, honest, "and I am glad you understand that now." I paused for a moment, considering what came next, not trying to soften anything, not trying to make it easier, just stating what was true, "but I am not going back." I read the sentence once, making sure it felt right, not harsh, not defensive, just clear, and then I sent it, closing the laptop afterward without waiting for a reply, because I did not need one. The decision had already been made, not in that moment, but over time, through everything that had led me here. The silence, the distance, the quiet realization that I had been living in a space where I was not truly seen. And now, sitting in my own apartment, in a life I was building for myself, I felt something else take its place. Not anger, not resentment, just a steady sense of self, something grounded, something real. And as I moved through the rest of the evening, making a simple dinner, organizing my notes for the next day, preparing for a call with a new client, I realized that this was no longer about proving anything to anyone. It was not about showing them what I could do or what they had lost. It was about something much quieter, much more personal. It was about choosing myself, consistently, without hesitation, without apology, and for the first time, that choice felt natural, not forced, not difficult, just right. Months passed, and life did not suddenly become perfect. It did not turn into something effortless or easy, but it became something else, something quieter, something steadier, something that finally felt like it belonged to me. My apartment was still simple, still filled with small, intentional choices. A chair by the window where I drank my coffee every morning. A desk that held more than just work now. It held direction, clarity, purpose. And even on the days when things felt uncertain, when the work was heavy or the silence stretched a little too long, there was a difference I could not ignore. I was no longer living in a space where I had to question my worth. I was no longer measuring myself against expectations that were never mine to begin with. I had built something, not just a business, but a life, piece by piece, decision by decision, and it was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was real, and that mattered more than anything else. Sometimes I still thought about that hospital room, about the words that were said, about the silence that followed, and for a long time, I believed that moment had broken something in me. But now I see it differently. It revealed something. It showed me what I had been ignoring, what I had been excusing, what I had been quietly accepting, and once I saw it clearly, I could not unsee it. I could not go back to being the version of myself who stayed quiet just to keep the peace, who waited for someone else to choose her, to defend her, to see her, because the truth is, if someone cannot stand beside you in your most vulnerable moment, if they cannot protect your dignity when it matters most, then no amount of time, no amount of explanation will turn that into something it is not. And that is not something to hate them for. It is something to understand, clearly, honestly, without illusion, because clarity is what allows you to move forward without carrying the weight of confusion, without questioning yourself every step of the way. I learned that boundaries are not something you announce loudly, they are something you live. Quietly, consistently, in the way you choose what you accept and what you walk away from. I learned that healing does not always look like returning to what was. Sometimes it looks like letting go of it entirely, even when it is difficult, even when it means starting over. And I learned that independence is not just about being alone. It is about being whole within yourself, about knowing that your value does not come from someone else's approval, someone else's expectations, or someone else's definition of who you should be. If you are listening to this right now, and you feel like you have been shrinking yourself to fit into a space that does not truly see you, I want you to know something simple, something real. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to step away from what hurts you, even if it is familiar, even if it is expected, even if it is hard. And that choice does not make you selfish. It makes you honest. It makes you strong in a way that is quiet but unshakable. Trust that feeling inside you when something is not right. That small voice that tells you the truth even when you try to ignore it. Whether you call it intuition or faith or something deeper, it is there for a reason. And when you listen to it, when you follow it, you are not losing something. You are finding your way back to yourself. Protect your peace. Protect your time. Protect your energy. And yes, protect your financial independence as well. Because having something that is yours, something you can rely on, changes the way you move through the world. It gives you options. It gives you strength. It gives you the ability to walk away when you need to. And that is not something to underestimate. There will be days when it feels lonely, when the silence feels heavier than you expected. But even in those moments, there is something else beneath it, something steady, something that reminds you that you are no longer living in a place that asks you to become less just to belong, and that matters more than anything you left behind. I truly believe that God, or the universe, or whatever you believe in, does not remove things from your life without making space for something that aligns more closely with who you are meant to be. Even if you do not see it right away, even if it takes time, there is meaning in what you are going through, there is growth in what you are leaving behind, and there is something ahead of you that is waiting for the version of you who is no longer willing to settle. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for understanding, for allowing these words to reach you in whatever way you needed today. You are not alone in what you are feeling, and you are not wrong for wanting more. If this story spoke to you, you can share where you are watching from or what time it is where you are. I read those moments as reminders that we are all connected in ways we do not always see. And if you feel like someone else might need to hear this, you can share it, you can pass it forward, because sometimes the right story reaches the right person at the right time. My name is Olivia Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is this: never let anyone else define your worth when you are the one who has to live with it every day.